All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm really excited to have our presentation today covering housing and homelessness prevention for transition age youth. Let's go to the next slide. And so, like mentioned before, both Marissa and I are from the Youth Law Center, which is a qualified support center that provides free legal training, technical assistance, and advocacy support to the legal community across California. And so if you're interested in training or workshops, work groups, outreach, consultation, research, or collaborating with us on advocacy support, please reach out. We're excited to support all the wonderful work that's happening across the beautiful state of California. You can go to the next slide. And so our areas of expertise cover a really wide range involving all things system involved young people. And so if there's a particular issue area that you see listed here that you're interested in talking more or seeing some of the resources that we have available at the Youth Law Center, please feel free to connect. Both Marissa and I will be sharing our emails at the end of the presentation. And so excited to hear from folks. Next slide. And so, as mentioned at the top, my name is Chris Middleton. I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Youth Law Center, sponsored by Baker McKenzie and Salesforce Inc., which is the really long way I get to say that I have a funded legal fellowship that's focused on homelessness prevention for transition age youth who are system impacted. And I'm really excited to be joined by my colleague Marissa, who will introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Marisa Lopez-Scott. I'm a senior attorney here at the Youth Law Center. My work really focuses on supporting legal aid attorneys in California around issues that impact youth experiencing homelessness or involvement with the child welfare or juvenile justice systems, and also connecting those folks at civil legal aid to juvenile court counsel as well. Just for background, because I think it's helpful as we get into this topic. Before coming to the Youth Law Center, I was a dependency attorney, so I represented children ages 0 to 21 in their child welfare proceedings. And before that, I was a civil legal aid attorney representing youth impacted by homelessness through the provision of comprehensive legal services. And so that's my background. Thank you all for joining. And also, if you'd like, you're welcome to throw your name and your organization in the chat. I think it would be helpful for us to have a sense of who is here for the presentation today. Thanks.
And you can go to the next slide. And so, standard disclaimer that the presentation today is being provided for educational and or informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. And as we mentioned at the top of the presentation, if you have any questions as we're presenting material, feel free to throw those in via the Q&A feature. Also, if it's easier, and I know some folks are kind of set in their ways, you could also use the chat feature as well. And don't worry if you want to wait until the end and kind of save your questions for then. We'll be happy and do our best to leave some time at the end for questions as well. And so with that being said, let's go to the next slide and get started. And so we're hoping to cover a lot of content today around a lot of the different resources and information that's salient to supporting young people and ensuring that they have access to housing. To get started, we're going to go over some background research on making sure we're on the same page of who we're actually talking about when we're talking about young adults experiencing homelessness. We're then going to talk about the importance of ensuring that we're screening for relevant questions that will help support young people who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. We're going to do our best to cover the variety of housing options that are available to transition age youth. We're going to focus on some housing preservation strategies and then end by reviewing some best practices for working with Tay, especially Tay with this particular background. And so we're going to dive into our first topic now. So you can go to the next slide. And so I know that there might be a lot of folks who have different levels of experience or familiarity with youth homelessness. And so we thought it would be really great just to start off with a little bit of a level setting or making sure we're all understanding or aware of some of the basics about youth homelessness. And so that's what this section is really going to focus on. Next slide, please. And so we want to start off by noting that there are a variety of different definitions of homelessness. And so one of them comes from the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which is very commonly just referred to as McKinney-Vento. And you often see this in the context of K through 12 education. And so it's focused on any student lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And this definition of homelessness includes young people who are staying at hotels or motels, emergency shelters, who are doubled or tripled up. And that's referring to when young people are staying with either friends or family for an economic reason. And so if you have, like, for example, a mom who loses her job, and then the mom and her children move into with the aunt, and then the young people are living, for example, in a living room of the aunt. That is an example that fits into youth homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Act. And you'll see why we focus on that when we look at the HUD definition soon. But it's a rather broad expansion of different circumstances young people may find themselves in that fit within the definition of homelessness under McKinney-Vento, and I think really maps onto what the experience of youth homelessness frequently looks like for young people. We can go to the next slide. The other definition that we wanted to highlight comes from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. That's defined as a person who lacks a fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence. And the key distinction here is that the HUD definition does not include the doubled up definition that we discussed in the McKinney-Vento homelessness definition on the last slide. And so the HUD estimates are based on a point in time count that happened on a designated day in January. And if you go to the next slide, that point in time count, especially when it comes to young people who are experiencing homelessness, are often criticized because it doesn't include all those individuals who are living doubled up. And research that's looked at the experience of youth homelessness across the United States, including in California, a large number of young people who are experiencing homelessness are often staying with friends or family. It's commonly described as couch surfing, and those young people wouldn't necessarily be counted in HUD's point in time count. And so something to consider whenever you're looking at data around the number of young people who are experiencing homelessness in your area or your county, because depending on what definition is being used, you might see very different figures based off of like the number of young people who are homeless and attending school K through 12 versus a number of young people who are counted in a point in time count in a particular county or geographic area. Next slide, please. And so as part of that background, we thought it would be useful to look at some of the available data that's available specifically focused on California. And this data is coming from the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, or ICH. And they oversee a variety of housing first guidelines and regulations, and are a really wonderful resource for folks who are interested in looking at the very different ways that different departments and agencies are coordinating their efforts to support young people who are experiencing homelessness. And I'm really grateful that we were able to share some of the data from the work that they're doing as part of our presentation today. We can go to the next slide. And so when we look at how many students through K through 12 who are experiencing homelessness in California, this is using the McKinney-Vento definition that we shared at the start of the presentation. So around 4% of California students experience homelessness in the 2022-2023 school year. And so around 8,500-ish students were unaccompanied. That means that they're not part or not staying with a biological family unit and are not necessarily being experiencing homelessness alongside a parent or guardian. The majority of those students, that 83%, were living doubled up, meaning that they were, as colloquially described, couch surfing with a friend or family member or other individual. Around 7% were in temporary shelters, 6% were in hotels and motels, and 4% were unsheltered. And I think this data really highlights, as I mentioned before, some of the flaws of the HUD point in time count. Based off of this McKinney-Vento data, you can see that there's the vast majority of students who are experiencing homelessness in California are doing so in the experience of being doubled up. But when you look at only the HUD data, those students wouldn't necessarily be counted, and the number of young people who are experiencing homelessness in the point in time count that's done in January. And so I think it's really important to also note that California has a really outsized percentage of the number of homeless students in the United States. And so 19% of all homeless students in the United States live in California. And so this is a significant challenge for our state. Next slide. And so it's not just students who are in K through 12 who have an experience with homelessness. We also know from available data that a significant percentage of young people who are pursuing higher education are also struggling with housing issues and housing stability as well. So the data shows that 1 in 4 California college community college students are experiencing homelessness, and more than half report housing insecurity. Around 10% of California State University or CSU students were reported experiencing homelessness, and that's 1 in 20 University of California or UC students are experiencing homelessness. Next slide. And so we also know that there are certain special populations within California's young people that are more susceptible or more likely to experience homelessness. Amongst those are the system-involved young people that many of you perhaps are working to support in foster care, the juvenile justice system, the criminal justice system, and even the military are more likely to report that their basic needs are not being met. And around 2/3 of the students with basic needs and securities received at least one form of public assistance, most commonly food assistance, and only 16% accessed housing assistance. And so there seems to be a really huge opportunity to increase the number of young people who are able to access support for housing, as well as increase the number of young people who are able to access public benefits beyond just food assistance, which is most commonly the resource that students are able to successfully obtain. Next slide, please. And so when we looked at HUD's biannual point in time count, so it looked at a single night in January in 2023. It reported 10,173 minors in Tay experiencing homelessness, which is 19% of the national total. And so for the reasons that we've discussed throughout the beginning portion of that of this presentation, it's largely understood to be an undercount because it's not counting youth who are doubled up, which is from the data that we're able to look at through McKinney-Vento especially, is how many young people are experiencing homelessness, and it's not taken into account in that number. So even though it's already a grave concern that 19% of the national total are being housed, or sorry, 19% of the young people experiencing homelessness in the United States are within California, it's likely that a great number of young people who are experiencing homelessness via being doubled up just aren't being counted in that data. And so that's something that makes it difficult to have a full grasp of how many young people exactly are experiencing homelessness. But we have both data available from McKinney-Vento and HUD and try our best to paint a picture of how many young people are experiencing homelessness. Next slide. And we just wanted to highlight and thought it was very important to point out for the purpose of our presentation, but just for folks to know in general, that there are a large number of young people who are either current or former foster youth who are especially vulnerable or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And so we know that a large percentage of young people who are part of extended foster care report that they experience homelessness at some point during their time as part of extended foster care. We also know that a large number of young people who have a history of foster care involvement or involvement with the juvenile justice system go on to experience homelessness. And nationally, around 40% of homeless youth report a history of foster care. And for a more local example, in San Francisco, a report showed that 27% of San Francisco's homeless youth reported a history of foster care, and 33% reported a history of delinquency involvement. I'll note with the involvement of child welfare and delinquency, there often is a significant overlap with those young people. And we know that both systems can kind of feed into each other, where young people who start off in foster care maybe kind of push towards the juvenile justice system, and simultaneously, sometimes young people who are engaged in the juvenile justice system are pushed towards the foster care system as well. But in either case, we know that both sets of young people are being pushed towards youth homelessness more often than other populations. And the same was true when we looked at the number of young people who end up in the adult criminal justice system. 28% of California's prisoners who are under the age of 30 had a child welfare case or placement history. And then nearly 51% of the Cal Youth Study participants had been arrested by the age of 23. And so when we were looking at the outcomes that we're getting for young people in California who are in either the foster care or juvenile justice system, we're seeing that they're disproportionately being at risk of and actually experiencing homelessness. But then we're also seeing a large number of young people who are being pushed towards the criminal justice system. And so that's something to take into account. And I'll just make a small plug here. Following the Grants Pass decision in the Supreme Court, there have been an increasing number of cities and local communities that have pivoted towards criminalization as a way to respond to homelessness. And so there is a really grave concern that that push will also sweep up young people who have a history of foster care or juvenile justice involvement and increase the amount of criminalization that we're seeing amongst those populations. But if you have more thoughts about that or how to respond to Grants Pass, happy to have that conversation. I've presented on that as well. But now I'm going to pass it to Marisa, who will be discussing our next section.
Next slide. So now we're going to move towards our next topic, which is legal screening for youth experiencing homelessness and who may or may not have former systems involvement, and how, as a legal aid attorney, you may screen for some of those former statuses, current or former statuses. Slide. And so first of all, why, as a civil legal aid attorney, should you screen for either current or former juvenile court involvement? And the biggest picture is that system-involved youth, so youth who've been impacted either by the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system, have all the civil legal rights and civil legal needs of youth who are not system-involved, and then some. And so these benefits and age limits or end dates may or may not be connected to them currently being involved with a court. So even older youth may be eligible. It's also, when we talk about transition age youth, we loosely mean 13 to 26-year-olds. And really 26 is kind of that pivotal age at which many of these system-connected benefits, which, like I said, have different beginning, end dates, et cetera, kind of where those end, 25 or 26, depending on the benefit. But something that's just important to know is that these folks are already your clients, and you may be missing out on some really important potential remedies, benefits, housing opportunities for them if you don't know whether or not they were at some point in the child welfare system. Another thing I want to flag here, but I don't have many details yet, is that there's also a potential funding opportunity for legal aid around youth who are in the child welfare system. So there is a new federal final rule for foster care legal representation, which expanded the ability of 4E agencies. So Title 4E of the Social Security Act. These agencies are child welfare, probation, and qualifying tribes. The new rule expanded those agencies' ability to claim federal reimbursement for the administrative costs of legal representation for a child who's in 4E foster care, a child who's a candidate for 4E foster care, the child's parents, the child's relative caregivers, and the child's Indian custodians, and to include civil legal aid matters. So this conversation is ongoing. There have been some work groups with the California Department of Social Services, but this is a new rule. There's a lot to be figured out in terms of implementation, but CDSS is very excited about this. So please do reach out if you want to learn more about 4E for civil legal aid. And then finally, I just wanted to give an example of a kind of benefit that doesn't that goes beyond foster care and that is important to screen for. So there is something called, and which we'll talk about later when we get into the housing section, in particular, like the Transitional Housing Placement Program Plus, THP Plus for short, which is a transitional housing program for youth ages 18 to 25 who were in foster care on or after their 18th birthday. And so for a 24-year-old who's experiencing homelessness, who may have been in foster care at 18, they may be entitled to and be able to apply for the THP Plus program to provide housing, even though they are no longer in foster care. And that program in particular is for youth who are no longer in foster care. Slide. And so some example screening questions of what you may be able to ask to get at the information about whether or not someone is currently or was formerly in either the child welfare or juvenile justice system. I'll also just note before getting into a few of these questions, they don't have to be extensive, nor do they need to ask for information that would be protected by Welfare and Institutions Code 827. But capturing the information early can help to ensure that legal aid youth clients and young adults are properly screened for all possible benefits that are uniquely related to these statuses. So some of these example questions may be, where were you living on your 18th birthday, or where were you supposed to be living? This first question is particularly important because youth who are under the age of 21 who turned 18 years old while subject to a foster care placement order, either through the juvenile dependency or juvenile delinquency court, or who turned 18 under an order for juvenile court guardianship or adoption, then lost the support of their guardian or adoptive parent, including losing the support through the death of the guardian or the adoption. Those youth may be able to re-enter what's called extended foster care, which I'll talk more about in a moment, to access age-appropriate services, supports, including housing, case management. And so to find out whether or not someone happened to have a foster care placement order on the 18th birthday, asking where they were living may help you get there, especially if they were somewhere like what we call a short-term residential therapeutic program, SDRTP, which is basically a group home. But that second question, the nuance of where were you supposed to be living, is just to get at the idea of subject to a foster care placement order means the court order. So there are some youth who are physically located somewhere else, whether that's juvenile hall or maybe staying with a relative when they're supposed to be at a group home, and that's what the court order says, who would also be eligible so long as the court order is a foster care placement order on their 18th birthday. Some of these other questions, like, have you ever lived with someone other than your parents? Has a court ever made decisions about where you should live? Have you ever had a social worker or probation officer or a lawyer? These are all more nuanced than just simply, have you been in foster care? Are you in foster care? Have you ever been on probation? Because some youth may not immediately know whether they were in foster care. Maybe they lived with grandma and they don't know how they ended up there. Maybe they ended up there very young. And so they don't necessarily know whether it was the juvenile court or a probate court, or whether no court at all was involved in making that decision. And also they may not be willing to share information about former foster care or probation at an initial intake. So some of these may start helping you piece together whether it's possible that they have these statuses. And so if you have questions about screening to find out whether or not someone was in foster care, or adding questions to your intake form, please do reach out to us. This is a topic we can talk about at length. Slide, please. And so now I want to segue into some housing options available today. Slide. And the first of which, we just want to talk a bit about extended foster care. This may be very repetitive for some folks, maybe new to others. And so we just want to do a little level setting and then talk about the placement options for youth who are in extended foster care. Then we'll talk a bit about rapid rehousing and the housing navigation and maintenance program, and then also housing options for former foster youth. So we'll move through each of those. Slide. So first, I just want to talk a bit about what we call extended foster care, or AB 12 in California. So it was passed in 2010. It stemmed from a federal law called the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008, which allowed for state agencies, those 4E agencies, to pull down federal funds to fund foster care for 18 to 21-year-olds. And so California was one of the earliest adopters of extended foster care. We passed our own Fostering Connections to Success Act, AB 12 in 2010, and it started to be fully implemented gradually implemented in 2012, full implementation in 2014. And what it is it provides an optional extension of foster care up to the age of 21. So this includes housing, case management, ongoing services to transition youth to independence beyond foster care. And it does help to solve the problem of just at 18, all of a sudden having this service cliff. I will say it's not perfect. We still have these cliffs now at 21 instead of 18, but it is supposed to be more gradual. And it is also supposed to be helping youth to build more networks of interdependence to help them beyond their time in foster care. And in California, we call our youth in extended foster care non-minor dependents, or NMDs. Slide. So who's eligible? I briefly mentioned this earlier. So a youth must have turned 18 years old while subject to a foster care placement order, either through the juvenile dependency or delinquency court. There's also small populations I also mentioned. So a youth who was under an order for a juvenile court legal guardianship or adoption order, then lost the support of their legal guardian or adoptive parent, may also be eligible to re-enter extended foster care, which we'll talk about in a moment. And also there's a very tiny percentage of youth who would be eligible for extended foster care, even if their underlying adjudication was vacated under Penal Code 236.14. These are functionally youth who were themselves victims of sexual exploitation. So their underlying adjudication was vacated, but they may still be eligible for extended foster care if they had that foster care placement order at 18. Those youth must then continue to be under the placement and care authority of the county placing agency, which could be either child welfare, juvenile probation, or the qualifying tribe, and live in a licensed or approved setting. And the youth has to have what they call a transitional independent living case plan, or a TILP, which documents the youth's willingness to satisfy one of the 5 participation conditions. These participation conditions are to either be enrolled in high school or an equivalent program, in college or vocational program at least half time, participating in a program or activity designed to remove barriers to employment. So maybe an internship or protected work, or just a youth empowerment program, doing counseling, whatever it is to work towards those goals, to remove the barriers to those types of goals, be employed at least 80 hours a month, or be unable to do any of those previous 4 conditions because of a medical condition. Slide. And so something that is different for young adults in extended foster care versus minors is that it's optional. But it is opt-out. So if a youth doesn't want to participate, they can request a hearing to terminate the juvenile court's jurisdiction. And when they exit care, the juvenile court maintains general jurisdiction over them under WIC 303B until they turn 21, which would allow them to re-enter extended foster care if they change their minds. They're allowed to re-enter an unlimited amount of times before they turn 21, and it's supposed to be accessible and easy. And they're entitled to benefits and placement by the county placing agency as soon as they've signed what's called a voluntary re-entry agreement with the county. Re-entry can be sought under WIC 388E or 388.1. That 388.1 is for those youth who were in a guardianship or adoption that fell apart after 18 but before 21. And the juvenile court form for this is a JV 466. Next slide. And so youth who are in extended foster care have all the same placement options. Oh, I'm sorry. Placement options as those for minors. So foster parents, which we in California call resource parents, as well as all the other placement options. But they also have 3 additional placement types, which are, and I apologize for the alphabet soup. We've tried to spell out all the acronyms at least once, but I know that for some folks, this is a whole new language. but we call them supervised independent living setting SILs. And these are only for these young adults age 18 to 21. We'll talk through each of these in a moment, so I won't read them off the slide, but the site to where you can find them is there as well. And for youth who are California youth who are placed out of state, they can still receive benefits and keep their case open even though they're not residing in California. And so something that's just important to know about these youth who are in extended foster care, because they're in foster care, the juvenile court and the county placing agency have responsibilities to this youth. So advocates should become familiar about each of the different people who's making decisions in a youth's case. And also these youth should have court-appointed counsel. So in California, these youth continue to have a dependency or a juvenile attorney or juvenile defender assigned to them. And so they can be a critical partner in making sure that these youth rights are protected. And also youth in extended foster care have rights under the Foster Youth Bill of Rights, which is WIC 16001.9. And they retain all their personal rights as adults under California law. So remaining in foster care does not limit any of their adult decision-making rights. Next. And so a bit about the Transitional Housing Placement Program for Non-Minor Dependents, also called THP&MD. It is a transitional housing program for youth in extended foster care that provides both housing and supportive services to these youth. They are licensed as children's residential facilities by the Community Care Licensing Division of CDSS. And an important just advocacy alert here as well. So since the passage of AB 12, which created extended foster care, this new placement setting of THP&MD has actually operated under interim licensing standards. And just last Friday, the Office of Administrative Law posted the official comment notice to make these regulations permanent. So those comments are due on November 6th. If folks are interested in learning more about these regulations and the regulatory process, please reach out to me. This is the last opportunity to make additional comments and suggestions to CDSS. And I know a lot of advocates have been working with CDSS since at least 2015 on the creation of these regulations. Next. And so who's eligible? It's these youth in extended foster care, so age 18 to 21, who are under the Placement and Care Authority, the county agency, and there's no maximum duration. So as long as the youth is in extended foster care, they could be in THP&MD for all 3 years. There's no, only 2 years of this kind of housing. What is important is that they do have to have an open foster care case as a non-minor dependent to be eligible for this program. It is statewide. Some counties have many providers, other counties only have one, and there are some counties without any at all. It is common for youth to be placed in other counties. So, but of course, counties or providers may or may not have capacity for youth from other counties. But these are available statewide. Next. So the next kind of housing available for youth in extended foster care is called a supervised independent living placement, a SILP. They're not licensed foster care placements that are available for youth ages 18 to 21. And they're really designed they're supposed to be for youth who are able and ready to provide for themselves financially. They can look like almost anything. In the sense of they could be renting a room in a house, a college dorm could be a SILP, staying with a friend at their apartment could be a SILP, or having a roommate in an apartment. Even living with your own biological parent can now be a SILP. And so it really, the readiness assessment, which is part of how someone would ask to be placed in a SILP, should look at the readiness to live in that particular SILP, right? So someone may not be ready for their own apartment that they have their own lease, but if they're living with a family member and getting the SILP payment, they could be ready for that as that. And so, the inspection is just basic health and safety. It doesn't require fingerprinting of anyone else who lives there. It doesn't require licensure. And this is a kind of setting in which the youth can receive their foster care payment directly to them. Next. And the most recent addition to this placement array is a very short-term placement called a transitional living setting, TLS. It's supposed to be for youth who are re-entering foster care or transitioning between placements. You can kind of think of it like a SILP light or a SILP like temporary. It's just supposed to be, it can be somewhere that's interim before someone gets to a more permanent placement. Something like a hotel or a motel, staying with a friend, but it does allow the payment of a foster care payment to these youth as they move into something more permanent, like a SILP or a THP. If you're interested in learning more about that, the ACL is there. So with that, I will transition it back over to Chris.
Thanks for that, Marissa. And so I'm now going to talk about rapid rehousing for youth. And I'll just note at the top here that unlike a lot of the programs that Marissa just covered, which are specific for young people who are in extended foster care, with rapid rehousing for youth, it is a service that's provided for HUD and is not limited to young people who have an open foster care case. And so rapid rehousing for youth, defined as young people who are below the age of 25, is made available through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and their Continuum of Care program. And so I've learned, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, there are a lot of different levels at which a COC, a Continuum of Care, might be structured in California. If you're living in a major metropolitan area, you might have a city, your individual city might have a COC, as well as the county might have a COC. If you're living in the more rural parts of California, including the truly northern part of California up and around Shasta, you might have several different counties working together to have one COC that's offering support to people in need in a variety of different counties. And so when we say COC, I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of different ways in which that might be structured in your community, but this service should be available through that COC, no matter if it's a city, a county, or a combination of different counties working together. And there are really like three core components of the rapid rehousing service. It's meant to provide a foundation that allows individuals and families sometimes to have access to stability that allows them to exit homelessness and ultimately end up obtaining permanent housing. And the way they do that is through providing short-term or medium-term rental assistance, also providing support through case management that allows adults, especially, to be able to navigate the finding of housing, the moving in process, as well as providing some stabilization services and connecting young people, especially to services that might be able to assist them as well. And so if you have a young person that you're supporting, you go through the screening, they don't have an open child welfare case, they're not a former foster youth, but they're a vulnerable young person who is experiencing homelessness. This is an option that is available to them and is something that you could consider. I see there's a question in the chat about criminal records. My understanding is that my understanding is that just like with several of the other offerings through HUD, there are some opportunities for local public housing authorities to set certain restrictions around individuals with criminal records. I know that young people who have a juvenile record, that is usually not prohibitive, but I will go back and check and get a response to specifically whether or not rapid rehousing is similar to other housing programs where you're able to add an additional restriction at the local level. And so I will go back to that. But if I don't, I'll try to follow up via email and I'll make sure I'm able to share that with the entire group. But my understanding from my familiarity with FYI, which is a program we're going to talk about later, that there are some restrictions that are able to be set locally by housing authorities, even if the federal HUD department doesn't set that restriction itself. And so the answer is it's complicated and it depends on what is set by the individual housing authority, I believe. But let me go back and do the research to confirm that. But that's a great question. And I'll note that for a lot of the resources that are available from HUD. That's a pretty common question that we get. And so if you're working with a particular local public housing authority on a regular basis to support clients, I think that's a really useful conversation to have with them, especially because it is something that I think is often, at least with FYI, at the discretion of that housing authority for certain offenses. And so if you're able to make the case that, like, hey, this is actually preventing a large percentage of the young people who are experiencing homelessness from being successfully housed, I think that that is an advocacy point that perhaps that you could explore. Um, and then I will have Marissa, if you want to come on and respond around whether or not criminal records are prohibitive for any of the extended foster care programs.
So they shouldn't be. And criminal record should not be a reason, even if someone has an adult conviction, to not be eligible for extended foster care. There are some very limited fingerprinting requirements for youth, but it's really when they're going to be placed with a minor, I believe. I can go and look for the provision. But generally speaking, it shouldn't be prohibitive for placement in a THP and MD program. And then for SILP, there's no background checks. It doesn't matter. And same with the TLS, the transitional living setting. But I do know there's a very, very small there's definitely a small rule, which I'll go and look up right now, around fingerprinting when it comes to transitional housing.
But yeah, those are great questions and keep them coming if there are things that we've presented already or something that we present now and you have a question. Always love to be able to just get them answered as soon as possible. And if we can't do it immediately, we'll follow up and look up the answers. So happy to help. All right, we can go to the next slide. Another important resource that we wanted to make sure people were aware of were Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program Funds, or HNMP. And so this is administered through the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, to county child welfare agencies to provide housing navigation to help young adults secure and maintain housing. And the current and former foster youth are a priority population for these funds. And so the annual H&MP funds were increased to 13.7 million in 2022, and the annual funding allocation was preserved in the 2024-2025 California state budget. I wanted to take a moment and just thank anyone on the call if you were involved in that fight to maintain these funds. These funds are really important to assisting young people and being able to take advantage of some of the other resources that we're going to talk about later on in the presentation and are really essential in making sure young people receive that initial support, especially in finding housing, staying housed, that's necessary. And so when it was initially proposed that this funding would be cut, I know that alarm bells went out around the state. And I'm really, really impressed by the amazing job a lot of different advocacy organizations, legal aid advocates as well, did at rallying around these funds to ensure that we're able to help support and house and keep housed young people across the state. And we can't predict what the future will hold. And so if we're able to show the utility of these funds and we all believe that they're able to keep young people housed, this may be a continued fight to expand or preserve in the future. And so I, again, just wanted to note, thank you to everyone who was part of that advocacy. Next slide. And so what exactly those funds can be used for? So they can be used to address move-in costs, security deposits, housing navigation, which is referred to how to help young people locate housing units. It also can be used to recruit and support landlords and provide landlord incentives. From talking to folks in a variety of different counties across California, I know that during the pandemic, the use of landlord incentives, especially, were really useful in getting landlords on board with accepting some of the other housing vouchers or other kind of housing supports that are available to young people. We have to acknowledge that there are a lot of unique situations about young people. They often have very limited credit history, and sometimes they may even have some challenges with their credit. And so having the opportunity to show landlords through incentives that there are some additional things that you can that you get with accepting these young people may make the difference between whether or not landlords are able to take on initial young people. And I think it's especially important when you're making a case to a landlord that hasn't necessarily accepted a young person who has that particular program support or benefit. And I think just like with anything, if you're able to demonstrate that it's able to happen successfully, you're able to increase the likelihood that the landlord will be able to accept it in the future. And so I think that the incentives actually go a really long way at expanding the pool of landlords that are able to offer housing and support and accept certain benefits from young people. And another important resource that's made or service that's made available is the variety of supportive services that are available to young people. With some of these options, young people are able to live independently for the first time, and they're like any other young adult who's trying to live independently for the first time. I can testify that, like, not so long ago, when I was living independently for the first time, there were a lot of questions around how to manage utility bills and building a budget for my household and being responsible and navigating a lot of the individual complexities of living and staying housed in California and dealing with the sticker shock of how expensive it is. I think it's really important to acknowledge that in many ways, are the young people that are your clients and who we're talking about today face a unique set of challenges and obstacles and barriers. But at the same time, they're also just like all the other young people who are trying to make this really important and sometimes scary transition into adulthood. And oftentimes, a lot of other young people are able to turn directly to family to provide that kind of support around navigating these initial steps of living independently. And these funds make available that kind of support that maybe young people don't have available through their kind of biological network of family or through their extended network of peers, but made available through the services that are made possible by these funds specifically. And so I think it's important to acknowledge both some of those unique opportunities and needs that young people have, but also to actually just acknowledge that they're young people who are entering into a normal adolescence phase of where you're living independently for the first time. And I think it's really important. And then Pam, I don't have a list off the top of my head. Marisa, do you have a list? Do you know?
I don't have a list of agencies. I do have a list of the county allocations, which I'll put in the chat. I will say it was my last understanding that the money had been pushed to counties, but whether or not the counties had been using it, and who was using it in the county, I think that that's still a little unclear. But I'm happy to put both in the Q&A, both the link to the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program funds in specifically, but there's also two other funding sources that are managed through housing and community development with current and former foster youth as priority populations that they also manage the purse strings for. So I'll put that website in there as well. I will say that John Burton Advocates for Youth is doing a lot of work in this area. So to the extent we're trying to figure out within any given county whether they've accessed their funds or in what amount and who is maybe contracting for it, or whether it's the social services agency or county welfare department itself, feel free to reach out to us, but we'd also be happy to connect to J-Bay as well.
Thanks, Marissa. Can we go to the next slide? And so the next benefit that we're going to talk about is Transitional Housing Placement Program Plus, or THP Plus, for former foster youth. And so it's a transitional housing program that provides a housing subsidy and supportive services that are facilitated by the county through a contract with the THP Plus agency and the tenant's actual possession of the housing unit that was secured, but not owned by the agency. So THP Plus programs are not licensed by the state like some of the other programs that we mentioned earlier on, and instead are certified by individual counties. And so this option is really important to consider for young people who have kind of passed through the age of eligibility for extended foster care, so older youth, as well as when you're trying to figure out a kind of plan or pathway for young people on how to maximize the amount of housing support that's available for them. When you start looking at the age eligibilities of different services, you're kind of able to put out a roadmap of perhaps up to around a decade of housing support that you're able to stitch together through a variety of different resources that are available. I'll note, not every young person is going to want to take advantage or be associated with the child welfare system for that long. But from a pure standpoint of thinking about how can I lay out all the different housing arrangements that are able to support my potential client, especially clients who are current or former foster youth, that is something to consider. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll be able to look at who is eligible. And so youth are eligible for THP plus if they emancipated out of foster care on or after their 18th birthday. And youth are eligible between the ages of 18 to 25 and can participate in the program for a total of 36 months. And so, like I said before, and I'll just note that that age and duration expansions became effective on July 1st, 2022. And so if you had prior information about the age range that was applicable and the duration of the program, we just want to note that that change did happen. And so if you can update that in all your planning and advising your clients. But then also when you're thinking about how to maximize or stitch together different programs, a number of the programs that were offered into age 21, for example. And so one thing that you can consider as a young person is exiting one of those programs is that that young person could potentially benefit from staying on in THP Plus as well. And they could start that as they're turning 21, enter into THP Plus. And that way they're able to maintain consistent housing, which is really important for this population, as well as maximize the duration of housing support that that individual has. And why is that salient? So let's say, for example, a young person takes advantage of a housing support while they're 18, and that young person decides, I'm going to pursue community college. Within that 3-year period, that individual is perhaps able to end their community college program. But let's say after that, that young person decides, hey, actually, now that I have this community college associate's degree or program, I want to actually transfer to a 4-year school or institution. You're able to utilize the additional funding through THP Plus to perhaps have housing that will last through the duration of while they're pursuing that degree, not using it to pay for on-campus housing, but using it to pay for housing and support them while they're pursuing education separately. And so when you're thinking about how to stitch together these different ideas, I think the priority is one, ensuring that young people are able to stay consistently housed. And two, I think in the background, it allows them to pursue some of those longer form goals that I think are generally associated with this time period. For many people, that includes goals that are centered around pursuing further education, career technical education as well, and participating in programs that ultimately put them on a pathway to be able to earn a wage that allows them to house themselves. And so I think it's really important when we're giving advice to clients to really think about how these different programs could be stitched together to maximize housing for that individual young person. And again, like many of the decisions that young people have before them, it's their decision. Many young people, for a variety of reasons, do or do not want to stay affiliated with the child welfare system. And I'm by no means telling you to force them to do that. But I think it's really important that young people are able to have this path put before them and understand how they might be able to leverage these different benefits to ensure that they're housed while they're working towards goals that will allow them to earn a wage to stay housed in California, which is, to be completely honest, no easy feat these days. And as housing prices increase, it's going to become increasingly challenging for young people and everyone to be able to obtain that goal. So next slide. And so the next program that we want to talk about is the Foster Youth to Independence and Family Unification Program Housing Choice Vouchers. while Marisa was presenting, I peeked through the participants and I see some familiar names from folks in the Bay and LA, where I'm sure you're really familiar with FYI and the program because I have talked to you ad nauseum about them. But for everyone else's benefit, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this benefit as well. And so FYI and FUP are types of housing choice vouchers that are available to public housing authorities from HUD. And they work in partnership with the public child welfare agencies or PCWAs. And they're really focused on young people who are leaving or have left foster care. And then with FUP, there also is the applicability of using those vouchers for families that have young children who are at risk of entering into foster care. And so for FUP, if the reason why a young person would enter into the foster care system is a lack of housing, that is a voucher that is available. Additionally, if a lack of housing is the reason why a family wouldn't be reunified, that is also a situation where the FUP voucher is applicable. FYI vouchers are really focused on young people who are between the ages of 18 to 24 who haven't reached their 25th birthday, are current or former foster youth, and have either been at risk or actively experienced homelessness after the age of 16. And so by default, the FYI voucher is a 3-year voucher program that can be extended for 2 additional years under the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, if available, if it's offered by your local public housing authority, or through fulfilling education or employment conditions. Some things to note about FYI in particular. It is a program that is voluntary, meaning that you need to have both the child welfare agency and the local public housing authority enter into an MOU in order for HUD to be able to issue vouchers to the local housing authority. Part of that MOU has the public child welfare agency agree to offer supportive services to young people who receive FYI vouchers. And no, the obligation is that the public child welfare agency has to offer the service. The young person doesn't have to accept services in order to receive the benefit. We know that young people run the gambit in terms of supportive services that they actually need to be able to successfully live independently and stay housed. And so it's really important that we're able to not just force young people to receive services that they don't actually need, but then also we're ensuring that young people who do have certain service needs are able to have them met. And again, this is another place where I just want to take a moment and acknowledge all of the hard work and advocacy that people are doing in their local community to make FYI vouchers more available. This hasn't been a very easy expansion, and I know that there's been a lot of work going to local city council meetings, going to county board of supervisors meetings, speaking and advocating with child welfare agencies, speaking and advocating with public housing authorities, and really making the case for why all these different agencies should buy in, have the necessary MOU, and ensure that we're able to bring these vouchers and federal dollars into our local communities to be able to house young people. Ideally, the way that I see FYI vouchers fitting into the array of services that are available in a particular county is to once again build upon that kind of path of housing that is available for current or former foster youth that now extends beyond the 25 years age that was at the other for the THP plus program, where you could have young people and potentially receive housing support through extended foster care or THP and MD, through THP plus, through an FYI voucher to give them a long runway to be able to navigate that transition out of system involvement while maintaining consistent housing that allows them to work towards the educational goals, the career goals, the personal development, the professional development that many of us are all doing during that time period, which is probably the bulk of their 20s. It's a really turbulent time for a lot of people for any number of reasons. And so being able to ensure that young people have access to that runway to success, I think can make a life-changing difference. I also think that FYI vouchers can be really useful when you have young people who are current or former foster youth, especially who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It's a way of connecting them with a voucher that's able to get them housed quickly. And I think it's also really important to think about how these vouchers could be used in a way that frees up resources for other individuals within a county. By being able to take advantage of federal dollars that we're able to draw in through these vouchers, we're freeing up local resources to be able to spend on other youth who perhaps aren't in the foster care system or who are younger and are able to be adequately supported by the local by the other resources that are available. And so I think it's really important to try to think about how this particular resource can fit into all the other different resources that we've already covered. And we can go to the next slide now. Sorry, I kind of buried the lead here, but these are the eligibility terms for FYI that I alluded to earlier. And so it's between the ages of 18 to 24, meaning they haven't reached their 25th birthday at the moment of leasing up. So that's the critical age eligibility cutoff that you have to look at. So it's not when you submit the application to the Public Housing Authority. So I will note the quickness through which a young person is able to successfully find housing and lease up. I said it's quick. It is not always quick. I have to acknowledge that. It really depends on the availability, the effectiveness of existing housing navigation services. But sometimes we've encountered situations where a young person has identified a landlord that's actually willing to accept the voucher, and the delay is actually caused by the fact that we're trying to arrange which particular housing authority is able to issue a voucher to that young person. That's not always the case. And so sometimes I would say the delay is really caused by not being able to find housing for a particular young person. And sometimes there isn't that delay because the landlord has already been identified and has expressed that they're willing to accept a voucher to house that particular young person. We often see that when young people perhaps were utilizing another benefit to live in a unit that's owned by a particular landlord. The landlord enjoys, appreciates the quality of tenant that that young person is and would like to continue to be able to have them as a tenant. And so that can be a smooth transition. But there are some challenges that exist. But I'm hoping that by utilizing HM&P funds and other funds that are available with housing navigation, you're able to, both on the side of child welfare and for a local housing authority, be able to build out that pool of landlords that are aware of the FYI vouchers and are able to house young people quickly. I will say that there's also in many of the large metro areas, I'm thinking about in the Bay and in LA County in particular, where there is just a really long waiting list for young people who are not a formal waiting list even, but there are the need for these type of vouchers far exceed the current availability. And local advocates are really trying to expand the number of housing authorities that are able to offer vouchers to try to meet that need. And so I would say that there are multiple fronts in which there are rooms for improvement. One of them is on the housing navigation piece and building out the pool of landlords that are aware of and accepting these vouchers. The other piece, I think, is also building out the capacity to offer vouchers to young people who are eligible and in need. And so that's a great question, and I hope I was able to kind of clarify that. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so there are two different ways through which vouchers are obtained by housing authorities. One is through a competitive process, which most recently completed this year. And then the other way through which a lot of local housing authorities are able to obtain these particular vouchers is through a non-competitive process, where the Public Child Welfare Agency and the Housing Authority enter into that MOU or via a letter of intent. The Child Welfare Agency refers to youth and verifies their eligibility. The Child Welfare Agency has to arrange for services, and then the Housing Authority takes those referrals and then requests a voucher from HUD. And so there are 50 vouchers per fiscal year that a housing authority is ultimately able to draw down. it states that there's initially a 25 number allocation, but housing authorities are able to draw down 25 additional vouchers. Additionally, under the most recent kind of notice that governs this program, counties, the local public housing authority is able to explain why they should be able to draw down an additional 25 vouchers before they've reached that 90% utilization rate, which was a barrier to drawing down additional vouchers in the past. And it's a really simple paragraph narrative that housing authorities are able to write and offer that have been accepted by HUD to explain why, in particularly large metro areas, why waiting to meet that 90% threshold might be a barrier for housing young people, especially when the need the applicable population is so large. And so that's FYI. I believe I'm now going to turn it over to Marisa. We have a variety of resources on FYI, so while Marissa's presenting, I might try to go and grab one. But thank you all.
All right, so now we're going to transition to some housing preservation strategies that civil legal aid attorneys can support these youth with to help them maintain and also obtain housing. Slide. So something that is important as we move into this discussion, we're not just talking housing. It's really important to address some of these other hardships that are extra extra sort of barriers for current and former foster youth that may impact their ability to get and also maintain housing. So the first is just economic hardships, gaps in education or employment, things like foster youth moving constantly between schools. And even though there's some education protections for youth in foster care to help ensure they're able to stay in what we call a school of origin or graduate with just the state minimum of credits versus what that particular district requires, it's not uncommon for there to be gaps in education for youth. And of course, less education may impact their ability to get more or better paying jobs. Additionally, youth who move into extended foster care or generally in the foster care system, the process of foster care pulls a youth out of their network, right? It pulls them out of their home. It pulls them away from community and other supports that may be able to help provide not only monetary support, but emotional support and long-term guidance. And so youth who have experiences in foster care or in the juvenile justice system are lacking some of these intradependent and community connections that many young adults rely on well up to the age of 30. And finally, youth with experiences in foster care and the juvenile justice system have experienced trauma. We'll talk more about that in a moment in terms of the impact of trauma and the ability to access certain services. But it's just an important thing to keep in mind that in order for these youth to be stably housed, there's many of these other aspects that have to be addressed to provide for the stability to do that. So slide. One of the first things that legal aid attorneys can do in screening for current or former foster youth status is for those youth who are under 21 or between 18 and 21, they could, if a youth would be eligible, help petition to have them re-enter extended foster care to be eligible for foster care placement and support. This is something that if you're not screening for and you just have a 20-year-old in your office and don't realize that they were in foster care and they may not realize the process to re-enter, that they could do so to be able to access appropriate benefits and supports. Additionally, youth who were in guardianships or adoption and then had an adoptive parent die at 19 may be eligible to re-enter. So those are just important things to screen for. Next. Some housing specific strategies, of course, enforcing tenant protections for youth who are in a housing situation, things like habitability or reasonable accommodation requests for youth with disabilities. Related to the FYI work, also protecting against source of income discrimination. I know that filing a complaint with CRD, unfortunately, on that side doesn't really result in much, but they at least now have a portal for discriminatory applications or advertisements. And for youth who are trying to obtain have an FYI voucher and are running into issues with landlords accepting them, it's at least a way to bring that to the notice of CRD. Also representing youth in eviction proceedings or helping to prevent them. And then also helping youth navigate housing options across different systems. So I know we talked a bit about rapid rehousing and FYI and some of these other sources that are linked to extended foster care or having been in foster care. So helping understand the landscape of what may be available. An example being that, you know, maybe a 19-year-old who exited extended foster care wants to go apply for THP plus. Well, that is technically possible. The THP plus program is for 18 to 25-year-olds. However, a youth would only be eligible for up to 36 months or their 25th birthday. And if they start that clock at 19, they'll be out of it at 22 versus if they, let's say, go back into extended foster care, they do a SILP or THP and MD all the way up to 21, then they go to THP plus, that extends the runway, right, for another 3 years beyond that time. And so helping youth to understand the differences, of course, you know, some youth may still decide I can get a housing spot in THP plus today. I don't want to be in the child welfare system anymore. I'm done. And that's fine, but also being able to advise and give more information about the options to maximize the possibilities is really important. Sorry, is there a question? Okay. Next slide. Oh, sorry. That's the right slide. File a complaint. So for youth who are in a licensed transitional housing program, like the transitional housing program for non-minor dependents, because they're licensed, anyone can file a complaint with the Community Care Licensing Division of CDSS if the program is violating the rules and regulations and violating the rights of the youth. So that may be a way to help a youth maintain housing. Let's say the program is trying to exit them for some incident that happened. You know, filing the complaint may help to preserve the housing if you know that really did the issue didn't happen, or the program itself is doing something unlawful and that is also resulting in the youth having to leave the housing. So that's certainly a way. Also helping youth combat some of the barriers, which we talked a bit about earlier, but that they may have based on protective classes or just other things like criminal records or limited or poor credit history. Something I also want to flag within this is not a housing specific strategy, but is implicated here. Unfortunately, youth with experience in foster care have a very high prevalence of having their identity stolen. Their information's in lots of places. So it's very possible that they have poor credit while never actually obtaining credit themselves. I will say county placing agencies do have obligations to youth in foster care over the age of 14 to pull an annual credit check for them. And also if the credit report reveals any accounts, their case plan with the court and with the agency is supposed to talk about the steps that the county's going to take to ensure that not only the youth understands what's on, and is able to interpret it, what's on their credit report, but also to resolve any inaccuracies on their credit report. And so counties are doing this in various ways. Some counties do it in-house and other counties are contracting with legal aid to do the credit repair. An example is in Santa Clara County, the Legal Advocates for Children and Youth, which is a component of the Law Foundation, does some of these cases for non-minor dependents. And so some of these barriers that may impact a youth's ability to get a lease or their ability to pay to get utilities, things like that. This is another place civil legal aid can help step in. Another way is to help make sure your counties are actually accessing their allocation of the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program funds to help connect and stabilize current and former foster youth in their housing. Next. Another strategy is filing grievances. So an example just being in the THP Plus program, the Manual of Policies and Procedures does specifically require a grievance procedure, though grievance procedures are also required in other programs as well. So I just put the site for that one in particular. But that is also a way to potentially address some issues that are happening in the youth housing. And then also connecting youth to these housing programs. So giving them information about it and then helping sometimes with an application or referring them to a program that can is also a way to make sure that they can access housing that may be available to them. Next. Another way is to help youth make sure they're getting their public benefits. So for youth who are not system connected or have aged out, obviously there's GA or CalWORKs. CalWORKs is also available to youth, under 18 who may be living with a caretaker relative, even if they're not in the system, so non-needy CalWORKs. Youth in extended foster care may be eligible for CalFresh. So even though they're in extended foster care, they may be eligible. So helping appeal denials or reductions in benefits or helping with an original application. Same with Medi-Cal. So youth who were in foster care at 18 or older in California or in another state are eligible in California for former foster youth Medi-Cal for M up until the age of 26. No income or resource determinations or caps. And so this is certainly something to screen for if you're working in health access for youth to see if they were in foster care at 18, because they may be eligible for full scope Medi-Cal at the age of 25. Same with, this is sort of just a weird thing, but I still mention it. If a youth is with, is in a guardianship with through the probate court with a non-relative. So this is actually for youth under 18. But also youth under the high school completion rule, but have to get it before 18, they can get foster care benefits. So state AFDCFC, state foster care benefits, are available to non-relative guardians through the probate court. There's no extra benefits available to relative foster parents. They would still be, if they're on the probate side, they're still restricted just to CalWORKs, whether it's needy or non-needy. But non-relative legal guardians have this additional benefit. And oftentimes counties, the probate court doesn't know this, or they don't tell you this, and families this. And also if you call the social services agency to try and apply, a lot of people don't know about it as well. So helping youth make sure that they're getting benefits for that. And same with SSI as well. Next slide. And then, of course, appealing denials, terminations, reductions, et cetera, any of the benefits. Also, making sure that you're keeping up to date and finding expertise in all these other benefits, foster care benefits, AFDCFC, kinship and guardianship assistance payments, which is a permanency benefit for youth who exit the juvenile court system to a guardianship, or the adoption assistance payments. They are mostly for youth who exit the system, the juvenile court system, to adoption. There's a small percentage of folks who can get AAP who were not in foster care, but all of these benefits, there's not very many people who do this work. So the more that you can help you to actually make sure they're getting the payments to help them stay where they are, whether that's with a guardian or in transitional housing, making sure that those payments still continue to come is really important. And there are provisions for extended kin gap and AAP for certain populations of folks. So if, depending on when the guardianship was established or adoption, or the relationship between the guardian and the youth, or if the youth has a disability that warrants a continuation of assistance, some of these folks may be eligible to get these payments between 18 and 21, even though they exited care years earlier. And so that's also something to screen for. We're more than happy to provide technical assistance on any of these with regards to screening, finding out more about these benefits. Always looking for more folks to do these, sometimes referred to as just stepsister step benefits, that just not as many people do. All right, and with the slide, and I'll pass it back to Chris.
Another important resource that we wanted to highlight is access to specialty mental health services via CalAIM. And so Medi-Cal Specialty Mental Health Services, or SMHS program, it's carved out of Medi-Cal and operates under a waiver that's approved by the Federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under that section there of the Social Security Act. And so there's automatic access eligibility for youth who are under the age of 21 who have involvement in the child welfare system, juvenile justice involvement, are experiencing homelessness, and or are at high risk for experiencing a mental health disorder due to the experience of trauma. And so this was, of course, I think as many people on the call are familiar with, a really significant expansion of access to specialty mental health services. And these services, I think, can do a lot to ensure that young people are able to stay housed and receive the appropriate services that they need to meet the variety of their needs that might exacerbate whether or not they're able to find housing successfully or stay housed once it's obtained. And if you go to the next slide. So there's a very wide array of different resources that are available, from some that are rather intense and are intended for individuals who have a certain high level of need, to some that reflect maybe not as intense of an intervention, but can be really important in ensuring that an individual is able to maintain housing once it's obtained and receive the appropriate level of support. I'll note here that we've heard from others, folks who are doing work out there in the field and have been involved in some technical assistance, where individuals are being denied access to specialty mental health services despite meeting the criteria of both the access criteria as well as the medical necessity requirement that's spelled out by the law as well. And if you run into that, I recommend that you're also able to appeal those decisions when they happen, but then also you're able to bring a state fair hearing. And so I think it's really important. I think a lot of local governments are trying, or local counties are trying to figure out the correct criteria for this expanded population. And some are getting it right, and some are not quite there yet. And so you might have young people who meet this access criteria that are being turned away, either because counties have added unlawfully additional criteria to the eligibility criteria to receive the service, or they're misinterpreting this expansion and aren't applying it correctly. And so if you're running into that and you have questions about accessing specialty mental health services through CalAIM for your clients, again, that is something that I would be excited to have folks reach out about, and we're able to provide TA. And then also, if you guys have more general questions about this expansion, would love to hear from you as well. We can go to the next slide. And so again, for education, we just want to quickly highlight that it's important that while young people, especially those folks who are sub 18, are in K through 12 education, there are a lot of education needs that may arise throughout while you're supporting them. And so young people might need to be represented in special education proceedings with either obtaining an IEP or having an IEP be respected, especially as they're transitioning in between different schools. Also, they might need help to recover school credits after having to transition to different schools. They may need your representation at school expulsion hearings or other discipline proceedings as well. And then what's really, really salient for K through 12 students who are experiencing homelessness is that they have a pretty strong set of rights under McKinney-Vento. And again, I think this is an area where many local education agencies are aware of McKinney-Vento and are aware of some, but not all of those requirements. We frequently see issues around the right to enrollment without vaccination or other standard paperwork that's needed. Additionally, transportation supports and ensuring that young people have access to their school of origin, and then also ensuring that young people are able to receive partial credits as well. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, and so there are a variety of different strategies that you might consider as part of supporting a young person. Like Marissa alluded to, this population is subject to some really caught myself, really horrible exposure to fraud and having their identity stolen that has a negative impact on their credit. And so doing supporting them and repairing that can be a really important aspect of helping a young person get housed, because oftentimes when you're young, you have a really limited credit history. And so the impact of that fraud, of that identity theft, can be really outsized for young people who may not otherwise have a credit history. Also, you can help young people and ensure that they're filing their taxes and taking advantage of the foster youth tax credit. Also, representing them with any infractions or other tickets issues that they're encountering. You can file a writ to force public agencies to stop illegal policies at a more system level. And then you can also make community care licensing complaints or complaints to OICR or the foster youth ombudsperson. And then you can also request records and documents from public agencies to help them actually follow the policies that they have set when they are correct and lawful. And the real issue is the implementation and not just that they have adopted it in proper policy. And so these are just a variety of strategies that we thought we would highlight at the end here. But really, if you have more ideas or things that you want to talk about, please feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to discuss it. And now I'm going to pass it back to Marissa, who's going to close us out.
All right, just a few minutes here on best practices for working with Tay, which is, of course, we could talk about for much longer than we have left, but we'll move through the core values. So just first and foremost, and I know we've mentioned it a few times, young people in foster care and the juvenile justice systems and experiencing homelessness have and continue to experience trauma in these systems, from these systems. And it's really important to acknowledge and recognize that these experiences impact the young person's transition to adulthood by affecting, amongst other things, how they may process information, how they react to various interventions, and also form relationships, not only with people around them, but you as well as an attorney. It can also it can also impact how they approach risk, how they learn, their capacity to and willingness to connect with others and new people and people in positions of authority. And so it's really important to respect the youth and their agency and self-determination. Youth are the most important and experts on their own lives, and to give them the choice on what they want to do when it comes to advocacy is incredibly important. And so with that comes stated interest representation. So with this, a client would sign a retainer with you, and they would direct the representation. Especially with working with youth, sometimes in order to gain trust and build that relationship, an attorney may need to start with something that is not traditionally legal, in order to start to show that you're going to do what you say to get to the legal goal. An example may be connecting a youth with an after-school program that's going to get them into school that then is going to lead to something else, right? So helping connect the dots to make it so that they can get to whatever their eventual goal is really important. And then finally, confidentiality. Like all clients, attorneys who work with youth have duties of confidentiality and loyalty and zealous advocacy. And this is something to highlight as well for youth who are under 18. They have the same rights to confidentiality as adults. And so for those who may be working with minors, despite them being minors, they still have the same rights to a confidential relationship with their attorney. So it's really important to build trust, to do what you say you're going to do for a youth, to meet them where they're at. Also, to the extent you're able to meet them in the community, have no wrong door to get to your legal aid, to do different kinds of communication and follow up to ensure you're actually connecting and that you're able to provide advice that the youth is and information that the youth is able to then make decisions from. Slide. And so some of the other key steps in this are to keep up to date on adolescent development research. On the next slide, we do have a resource to do that. But also, to the extent you're able to, as an organization, commit to vertical representation rather than horizontal representation, so meaning that one attorney per client. Even if the attorney then needs to get technical assistance or substantial support from a colleague around substantive law, also to be able to provide comprehensive legal services. So maybe housing and family violence, DVRO and public benefits all from one person, even if they're getting a lot of TA from other people. Meeting youth where they're at, that's not just physically, but emotionally. And then also, like I said, another way would be also to partner with social workers to help enhance your representation. All right, slide. So here's some resources. I won't talk through any of them other than to highlight that webinar recording. We at Youth Law Center have something called the Transition Age Youth Civil Legal Practice Exchange, which is a practice support network and training series for civil legal aid attorneys, which anyone here is welcome to join. You can email me, and my email's on the last slide. But also one of the webinars we did last year, which I highly recommend, was with Dr. Jean McPhee at UCSF about brains in transition. So navigating young adults' neurodevelopment in legal settings. And this is a great way, and she gave a lot of practical tips on how to apply this research to a lawyer's practice. And then I'll also highlight the Baker McKenzie Homeless Youth Handbook, which is super comprehensive on all sorts of legal areas, with information about benefits, entitlements, rights, et cetera, for youth who may be experiencing homelessness. All right, just under the wire, last slide. Here's our contact information. Thank you all for sticking around. Please do complete the survey if you can, and feel free to reach out to both Chris and me if you have questions.
Thanks, everyone.